Seymour Martin Lipset once observed that the American labor union had needs that most organizations simply don't have. Thus, it had to make special demands of what might rightly be called its rank and file. He said this: "Because of its ultimate character as a combat organization, whose usefulness to its members lies in its collective strength in relation to management, the trade union has demanded more control over its individual members than do most types of associations." The post-revolutionary history of that development and the controversies that it evoked is a vitally important subject, particularly in the wake of many recent right-to-work laws, or what have often been called anti-labor laws, in state after state. Journeymen of the early 19th century, that is, everyday workers, had an awareness of a coming industrial age, and they began to organize. They understood that self-control and self-reliance were necessary if they were to prove effective against the considerable capital resources of their masters and their merchants. And they also understood that collective action may be necessary. Their actions reveal that they came to believe that they must combine in order to withstand the forces that appeared to be uniting against them. In Boston, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, the first journeyman societies, and these can rightly be called labor unions, although that term wasn't actually used until the 1830s, began to form between the end of the Revolution and the very early years of the 19th century. Class tensions were growing, and there were more wage-earning workers who had very little hopes of ever becoming masters themselves. The trajectory ought to be that someone worked for years as a journeyman and later became a master of his own shop. That reality, or that hope, no longer matched the reality. In Boston in 1790, for example, 45% of journeyman carpenters eventually became masters, according to a study by Lisa Leth-Lubau. By 1825, the number was 11% and falling. It was one example in one trade of how between the period of the 1790s and the 1820s, there was witnessed nothing less than the transformation of craftsmen into a permanent class of wage laborers. So journeymen began to join together, beginning in the last decade of the 18th century. In 1790, for example, journeyman carpenters in Philadelphia created an association and in 1791 went on strike for better wages, declaring to the people of the city that, quote, self-preservation has induced us to enter into indissoluble union with each other. A deterioration in relations between journeymen and master craftsmen that began in the 1790s and only grew worse in the early 19th century caused journeymen to form their own trade associations in city after city and to turn out or strike in struggles against their employers, who were also forming associations among themselves. These trends were largely confined to what historians sometimes call the conflict trades, or a few very specific trades where this tension between journeymen and their employers rose quite early. Shoemaking, cabinet making, tailoring, carpentry, masonry, and printing. Shoemakers seem to have the most trouble. In short, because of the economic transformations of the early 19th century and the ways that they looked very bad for these journeymen, who once could aspire to become masters in their own rights, they began to cooperate and combine to prevent further degradation. And they not only combined, but they did use a variety of tactics to try to improve their position, some of which began to result in criminal prosecution. In 1805, 8 Philadelphia cordwainers, shoemakers, were arrested after a failed strike. A demand for higher wages had ended in failure, and the cordwainers were forced to return to work at the old rate. But in an attempt to bring the pressure of the law onto the journeymen, the masters sought criminal charges against the shoemakers. The defendants were charged with criminal conspiracy. That is, they were charged with trying to exact, quote, great sums of money from their employers by refusing to work at the usual prices and rates, but rather forming themselves into a club and refusing to work for anything below a given rate, and pressuring other workmen to join their cause by means of, quote, threats, menaces, or other unlawful means. Jared Ingersoll and Joseph Hopkinson argued the case for the prosecution, contending that what the journeyman shoemakers had done fell under the common law prohibition on combinations for private benefit or criminal conspiracies that either injured the public welfare or violated the private rights of another citizen. That is, everyone agreed that it was legal and ethical for one man to decide to work only for a given wage and for nothing less. But the crime was in the combination. The crime was in joining together and making that agreement. One aspect of the debate that followed in Philadelphia in 1805 and 1806, and then in city after city in the decades to come, has rightly garnered a great deal of scholarly attention and is important to keep in mind here. Labor associations that sought to achieve through collective action these minimum wages were made illegal under the common law crime of conspiracy. That is, they weren't basing this on statutes that had been passed by the legislatures of the individual states. In virtually all of the conspiracy cases, from Commonwealth v. Pullis, which is the name ultimately given to this journeyman's conspiracy prosecution in Philadelphia in 1806, through the explosion of conspiracy charges in the 1830s, there were challenges to the idea that a common law crime of conspiracy was legitimate in Republican America. That is, it was being drawn from a monarchical past in England. This law perhaps simply had no relevance in post-revolutionary America. And they sought, many critics of these common law conspiracy charges, sought to limit courts to the punishment of crimes that were made so statutorily by the people or by their representatives. And there was another crucial question. Were labor unions themselves, regardless of the common law rising out of 17th and 18th century England, were labor unions themselves a violation of the commitments to individual rights that were central to the American Revolution? That is, wasn't the American Revolution fought to leave men free to make choices for their own pursuit of happiness? And are labor unions perhaps a threat to that? It's a fascinating question. There were 23 trials of labor associations on charges of criminal conspiracy in 6 of the United States between 1806 and 1850. The first, and there were no colonial cases that historians have ever been able to find, came in Pennsylvania in 1806 with these cordwainers or shoemakers that I've told you about. The central questions to be answered by courts as early as this first labor conspiracy trial had to do with that tension between the collective action of the labor union and the freedoms of the individual workers. As the prosecutor Joseph Hopkinson asked the jury in that year in Philadelphia, shall these shoemakers, shall these or any other body of men associate for the purpose of making new laws, laws not made under constitutional authority, and compel their fellow citizens to obey them under the penalty of their existence? He went on, if private associations and clubs can make constitutions for laws for us, if they can associate and make bylaws paramount or inconsistent with state laws, what, I ask, becomes of liberty? What, I ask, becomes of the liberty of the people about which so much is prated, about which the opening counsel made such flourish? Such questions are not merely rhetorical arguments in this first conspiracy trial in 1806. He said simply, this is Joseph Hopkinson again, the prosecutor against the shoemakers, shall a secret body exercise a power over our fellow citizens, which the legislature is not invested with? The fact is, they do exercise a sort of authority which the legislature dare not assume, that of telling people what wage they can work for. The jury was asked to decide whether the laws and constitution of the state of Pennsylvania ought to permit such claims of private governing power. The Journeyman Society, no doubt, claimed a power to govern the journeymen of their trade. That was the whole purpose. From their perspective, they did so in a way that was utterly democratic, though, completely in accord with American revolutionary principles. The prosecutor, Joseph Hopkinson, did spend a fair amount of time challenging the notion that the democratic form of association, the fact that they had voted to go on strike, that they had voted to support these wage laws, did anything to change the fact that the association claimed an unjust and, as it were, illegal authority over its members when it told those members who had voted against the idea that they too could not work for anything less than the demanded rate. He said that the vote was about 60 to 50 on this issue. And he said, let the 60 put what price they please on their own work. But the others are free agents also. Leave them free, or talk no more of equal rights, of independence, or of liberty. The defendant's attorney, Caesar Rodney, had argued the point directly, that in fact the democratic aspect of this labor union ought to be enough to satisfy us that this was not a violation of their liberty. He said, when you become a member of any institution, you engage to obey its rules. But the prosecutor, Hopkinson, would have none of it. The rules themselves must not abridge the rights of the members. Those rights ought to be inviolable, and in this case, those rights included the right to work for whatever wage one asked. And that was the key point. Hopkinson contended that the common law prescription on combinations for private benefit, these criminal conspiracy laws, were vital to prevent this kind of private tyranny, however democratically arrived at. The judge in this case, he went by the title recorder at the time. The recorder, Moses Levy, would embrace that argument when he charged the jury. Recorder Levy made different claims at different times about what authority was really being usurped by the journeyman cordwainers and where the injury lay. At times he said that they claimed authority over non-members and coerced unwilling men into joining their union. At times he said that they exercised an excessive amount of authority over their own members, even those who were there willingly. And he said that they sought a price-fixing power to set their own wages that was dangerous to the public at large. That issue of the non-members, that is, people who had never joined the union, who were being coerced to join it or to also abide by the same wage policies, was important to Levy. He believed that the Journeyman Society had left, quote, no individual liberty to join the society or to reject it, but rather compels him to become a member. Levy asked the jury, is there any reason to suppose that the laws are not competent to redress an evil of this magnitude? On that second point, the recorder agreed with Hopkinson that majority rule in this instance was a patent violation of the rights of individual members of the union. In the turnout of last fall, he said, if each member of the body had stood alone, unfettered by promises to the rest, many of them might have changed their opinion as to the price of wages and gone to work. But it has been given to you in evidence that they were bound by their agreement and pledged by mutual engagements to persist in it, however contrary to their own judgment. He honed in on the fact that the Journeyman Society appeared to be claiming a power to make law and to dictate to member and non-member alike what the marketplace should look like. And he did so in order to draw a line between legitimate and illegitimate collective action, between innocent combination, like a group of people deciding to engage a certain cause, and criminal combination, like a group of people dictating to one another what they could and could not do. The laws of the society are grievous to those not inclined to become members. They are injurious to the community, and they are not the laws of Pennsylvania, he said. Besides our own legislature, the recorder said, we seem now to have, quote, a new legislature consisting of journeyman shoemakers. The jury agreed with the prosecution. They fined George Pullis and the 7 other cordwainers or shoemakers on trial $8 each, plus costs. A decade later, in 1815, another Pennsylvania criminal conspiracy trial brought out the idea that the freedom of each journeyman to decide for himself at what wage he would work was deemed to be both a public and a private right, according to the court summation for the jury. It is the interest of the public, and it is the it is the right of every individual that those who are skilled in any profession, art, or mystery should be unrestrained in the exercise of it. What does all this mean for us now? A few things. First, I want to point out how the principles of the revolution, this commitment to individual rights and this commitment to the pursuit of happiness as something that should remain unfettered by laws, whether passed by the state or passed by this legislature of journeyman shoemakers, this commitment to the principles of the revolution have been used to resist labor organization from the very first opportunity. The first time that a labor organization was prosecuted, that was challenged by the laws of the state, the evocation of the principles of the Revolution of '76 were right in the mix. And we see that today. We see continuing evocation of basic principles, basic freedoms today in debates over the right to work laws and the debates over the legitimacy of labor organization as a part of our political sphere. Second, I want to point out how these principles have at times been used selectively in our history, where there were no punishment of masters' organizations. There actually was one in the midst of these few dozen prosecutions of labor organizations. But masters' organizations were not punished. Corporations were, in fact, protected by law. And last and most importantly, I want to point out how these principles of the Revolution of '76 have at certain moments in our history been used to keep people isolated from being able to collectively act, unable to cooperate together in the pursuit of their happiness, and left to stand alone or to fall on their own as they pursue their happiness. At times, the evocation of the principles of '76 have prohibited collective action that, as we have seen in many instances since the cordwainers' trial of 1806, are vital to the protection of the rights of working people. And the evocation of the principles of '76 can sometimes cut in two directions. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.